The morning air in the city was crisp, but inside the mansion, the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, freshly brewed coffee, and something less pleasant, Amelia's sweat. She wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, her chubby fingers trembling as she scrubbed the kitchen counter. She had been awake since 4 a.m., like every other day, cleaning, ironing, and cooking for a family that never showed her an ounce of kindness. "Amelia!" A shrill voice pierced through the kitchen. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The voice belonged to her aunt, Victoria, a woman with a face so elegant it could be on a magazine cover, but with a heart so cold it could freeze the sun. "Yes, Auntie," Amelia murmured, keeping her eyes down as Victoria stormed into the kitchen in her silk robe, her nails clicking against the counter. "Why does my tea taste like tap water?" she demanded, shoving the expensive ceramic cup toward Amelia. "Are you trying to poison me, you dull brain?" Amelia flinched at the insult but said nothing. She had learned a long time ago that speaking back only made things worse. Behind Victoria, her daughters, Isabel and Sophie, strutted in, their perfect hair bouncing as they giggled. "Honestly, Mom, she's so useless," Sophie sneered, grabbing a plate of toast and taking a bite. "I don't even know why we keep her. She's like a big, ugly rat that refuses to leave," Isabel added, smirking. Amelia kept her head down, staring at her swollen feet. She knew better than to cry in front of them. They loved seeing her cry. Her body ached from the endless work, her back sore from scrubbing floors that would never be clean enough for Victoria. And yet, despite everything, she stayed quiet, swallowing the pain like a bitter pill. Victoria scoffed. "Finish the cleaning, and for God's sake, take a shower. You stink, Amelia. Your body odor is disgusting." A wave of shame burned through her. No matter how much she bathed, no matter how many times she scrubbed her skin raw, it never seemed to be enough. As soon as they left, she let out a shaky breath and sat on the cold kitchen floor, hugging her knees. She was 22 years old, yet she felt like a ghost, unseen, unloved, unwanted. Amelia had never known love. Not from her parents, who had died when she was only 6. Not from Victoria, who had taken her in only to turn her into a servant. Not from the world, which looked at her with disgust and laughter. She had dropped out of school at 16. Not because she wanted to, but because the mockery had become unbearable. "Fat pig. Why do you even come to school? You'll never be anything. You're so dumb, even a 5-year-old is smarter than you." The words had followed her everywhere, whispered behind her back, shouted across hallways. Eventually, she had stopped trying. She didn't have friends. She didn't have a boyfriend or a girlfriend. No one had ever wanted her, not even as a joke. All she had was work. And food. She ate when she was sad. She ate when she was lonely. She ate when she was tired. It was the only thing that brought her comfort, even though it only made people hate her more. "Stop eating so much, you cow." Victoria would scream whenever she caught her sneaking food at night. "You're already disgusting enough." So Amelia learned to eat in secret, shoving bread into her mouth when no one was looking, swallowing her sobs along with it. She had no future. No dreams. No hope. Until one day, she decided she had to change something. It started with a whisper in the market. Amelia had been running errands for Victoria when she overheard 2 women talking about a fashion school nearby. "The best in the city," one of them said proudly. "If you learn from there, you can go anywhere." Fashion. Amelia had never dared to dream before, but for some reason, that word stayed with her. She wasn't smart, but maybe she could do something with her hands. Maybe she could build a future, escape from this life of misery. That night, as she lay in her tiny room, nothing more than a storage space filled with old clothes, she pulled out the small wooden box she kept hidden under her bed. Inside, there were crumpled bills and coins. Every penny she had saved from doing extra work for neighbors, from secretly keeping change when Victoria sent her on errands. It wasn't much. But it was all she had. Her hands trembled as she clutched the box to her chest. "I have to try," she whispered to herself. And for the first time in years, she felt something other than despair. She felt hope. Amelia clutched the small bundle of cash in her trembling hands as she stood before the modest yet well-known fashion school. It had taken her years of silent suffering, endless nights of crying, and months of sneaking away pennies from the little change her aunt gave her for errands. This money was her only escape, her only hope of changing her miserable life. Her heart pounded as she stepped forward, her oversized, faded dress clinging to her body. Sweat pooled at the back of her neck despite the cold morning air. She could already feel the judgmental stares from the well-dressed young men and women walking into the school, their confidence filling the air like an unspoken rule she had never been invited to follow. The receptionist barely looked up as Amelia stammered through her registration. "Name? Amelia Jackson." The woman looked up, her expression unreadable, but Amelia saw the flicker of disgust when her eyes swept over her body. "Age? 22. A smirk formed at the corner of the woman's lips. "You're a bit old for this, aren't you?" Amelia lowered her gaze, nodding slightly. She was used to the ridicule, the unkind remarks. This was just another moment to endure. After what felt like an eternity, she was finally handed her class schedule and directed to her hostel. As she walked through the hallway, whispers followed her like shadows. "Who let that in here? Does she even fit through the sewing machines? She smells. God, I can't breathe." Laughter erupted behind her, each cruel word a dagger to her already battered soul. Her hostel room was small but clean. It was shared with 3 other students, but the moment they saw her, their faces twisted in disgust. "You can't be serious," one of them scoffed, her manicured fingers clutching her designer bag as if Amelia's presence alone would taint it. "You're in the wrong place," another sneered. "This isn't a refugee camp." Amelia stood frozen at the doorway, unsure whether to move forward or retreat. "Stay on your side of the room," the third girl said, rolling her eyes. "And for God's sake, shower." Her hands clenched around the strap of her old bag, knuckles white. She had showered that morning, scrubbed herself raw, in fact, but nothing she did was ever enough. She spent the night curled up on her tiny mattress, staring at the ceiling. The faint sound of laughter and music from her roommates filled the room, but she was invisible to them. The first day of class was worse than she could have ever imagined. As soon as she entered the sewing workshop, the room fell silent. All eyes turned to her, filled with mockery and disgust. "Are you sure you can fit behind the sewing machine?" someone whispered loudly. Laughter echoed around the room. Amelia bit her lip and found a seat at the farthest corner, hoping to disappear. But disappearing was impossible when you were her. The instructor, Miss Linda, was a sophisticated woman with sharp eyes. She glanced at Amelia but said nothing as she started the class. Amelia tried to focus, but every move she made was met with giggles and whispered insults. When it was time for practicals, Amelia's fingers trembled as she attempted to thread the needle. She had never sewn before, and the task seemed impossible. "Are you stupid?" the girl next to her snapped. "It's just a needle, not a rocket science project." Tears burned Amelia's eyes. She fought them back, knowing that crying would only make it worse. By the time the class ended, she had accomplished nothing except earning herself a new name, Dull Brain. Every evening after school, Amelia visited the only person who listened to her, an old woman named Mrs. Carter. She lived in a tiny apartment near the school, always sitting outside with her old sewing machine. Amelia would bring her food, sit beside her, and cry. She poured out her pain, her loneliness, her hopelessness. Mrs. Carter would listen, nodding, occasionally wiping Amelia's tears with her frail hands. "You will be great one day, my dear," she would always say. "Mark my words." But Amelia never believed her. One morning, Miss Linda announced an upcoming competition. Every student had to design and sew a wedding gown. The winner would receive an award and a chance to work with a top fashion designer. Excitement buzzed through the room. But for Amelia, it was a nightmare. She didn't even know how to sew properly. Every time she tried, she made mistakes. "You compete," a classmate cackled. "You probably sew a gown that looks like a potato sack." The insult continued. Her roommates made it worse, laughing about how she would embarrass herself. "Maybe if you stuff the dress with food, you'll actually be good at something," one of them sneered. That night, Amelia cried harder than ever. She wanted to give up. But deep inside, something shifted. For the first time in her life, she wanted to prove them wrong. Amelia walked into the fashion school with hesitant steps, clutching her notebook tightly against her chest. The weight of the morning's abuse still clung to her skin like an unwanted perfume. Victoria had woken her up at 4 a.m. by dumping a bucket of freezing water on her. "Wake up, you useless pig. You think you're a queen that sleeps all day. Go and scrub my bathroom before the whole house starts stinking like you." Her skin was still damp under her faded clothes, her hair still wet. But she was here. She had dragged herself to this place that had begun to feel like another nightmare. The students were already gathered in small clusters, their laughter and chatter bouncing off the pristine white walls of the fashion house. She wanted to blend in. She wanted to be seen, not as a joke, but as one of them. But the moment she stepped forward, the whisper started. "Look at her. She smells again today. Does she even own a deodorant? I can't sit near her. I might choke." She kept her head down and walked past them, pretending she couldn't hear. But she did. She heard everything. She felt every knife their words plunged into her heart. She took a seat at the back of the class, as far from the others as possible. Her instructor, Mrs. Bennett, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, walked in and began the lesson. Amelia tried to focus, but the quiet snickers from the other students were louder than the sound of the sewing machines. "Amelia," Mrs. Bennett called gently. "Come and try stitching this piece." Amelia's heart slammed against her ribs. She hated this part. She was slow, clumsy. Her hands never seemed to follow instructions properly. And every mistake she made became another reason for them to laugh. She hesitated, but Mrs. Bennett's encouraging gaze pushed her forward. She sat down, her fingers trembling as she held the fabric. The needle slipped. The stitch was crooked. The fabric bunched up in an ugly, uneven mess. Laughter erupted behind her. "Oh my God, is this supposed to be a straight line? She's hopeless. She should just quit and go back to eating." Tears pricked her eyes, but she forced herself to hold them back. Mrs. Bennett quickly stepped in, placing a hand over Amelia's shaking one. "Take your time," she whispered. "You'll get better." But Amelia wasn't sure she ever would. That evening, Amelia took her usual detour on her way home. There was a quiet corner near an abandoned building where an old woman, Margaret, sat every evening, selling roasted groundnuts and plantains. Margaret was the only person who didn't look at her with disgust. Amelia approached with a small plastic bag tucked under her arm. "Good evening, Mama Margaret," she greeted softly. The old woman's face crinkled into a smile. "Oh, my sweet girl. You look tired today." Amelia sat beside her on a wooden stool, unwrapping the bag. She had bought some rice and meat from a street vendor, her little escape from the hunger that gnawed at her every day. She took a few bites, then passed the rest to Margaret. You always share your food with me, the woman chuckled, taking a small bite. But tell me, what happened today? Amelia sighed heavily, tears already pooling in her eyes. I don't belong there, she whispered. They hate me. They laugh at me. I don't know why I keep going back. Margaret's expression softened. You keep going back because you want to be better, she said gently. One day, they will see your worth. Amelia let out a bitter laugh. No, they won't. I'll always be ugly. Fat. Dumb. Useless. No one will ever look at me and see anything else. Margaret took her hand in her frail, wrinkled one. One day, child, you will shock them all. But Amelia didn't believe that. Not even for a second. By the time she got home, Victoria was waiting at the door. Where have you been, you lazy swine, she snapped. I was just... Shut up. You're wasting your time at that stupid school. Do you really think anyone will hire you? No one wants a fat, smelly thing like you working for them. Amelia flinched, but before she could move, Victoria slapped the bag of fabric she was holding out of her hands. I should throw you out, she spat. But I won't. Because at least you're good for one thing, being my housemaid. The girls, Isabel and Sophie, were sitting at the dining table, their noses wrinkled in exaggerated disgust. God, why does she smell like sweat and food all the time? Isabel gagged. She's a walking garbage bin, Sophie sneered. Amelia bit her lip, fighting the tears. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to be anywhere but here. 2 weeks later, Mrs. Bennet made an announcement. We will be holding a competition, she said excitedly. Each of you must design and sew a wedding gown. The winner will receive a scholarship for an advanced fashion program and a chance to work with a major fashion brand. Gasps of excitement filled the room. Except for Amelia. She shrank in her seat, her stomach twisting. She could barely sew a straight line. How could she ever sew a wedding gown? Maybe you should just sit this one out, a girl named Charlotte said with a smirk. You'll only embarrass yourself. The other students nodded in agreement, whispering cruel jokes. Amelia felt sick. That night, she sat in her tiny room, staring at her hands. Hands that had only known work. Hands that had never created anything beautiful. Hands that had never been worthy of anything. She thought about quitting. She thought about never going back. But then, she thought about Margaret's words. One day, you will shock them all. And for the first time, Amelia wondered, what if she could? Amelia had never been excited about anything in her life, but when she learned about the competition, a small flicker of something unfamiliar, hope, stirred inside her. It was faint, but it was there. She knew she wasn't good enough, knew she had never succeeded at anything before, but for some reason, she wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was her chance. The moment she got home for the holiday, she decided to tell her aunt and cousins about the competition. A competition. Sandra, the eldest cousin, snorted. For what? Eating the most food in one sitting. Their laughter rang through the living room, sharp and cruel. Amelia lowered her gaze, already regretting speaking. I'm serious, she murmured. You're serious? Her aunt, Teresa, narrowed her eyes, her voice dripping with mockery. Amelia, I told you to stop wasting your time at that fashion school. What have you even learned? Nothing. Now, you want to enter a competition. For what? You don't even know how to sew a straight line. Her younger cousin, Rita, burst into laughter. Can you imagine her sitting behind a sewing machine, sweating all over the fabric with that disgusting body odor of hers? Sandra fanned her nose dramatically. I pity whoever will have to judge that competition. The moment she enters the hall, they'll probably run away. Tears pricked Amelia's eyes. She had expected this, but somehow, the pain still burned like fire. Just drop this foolish idea, Aunt Teresa snapped. A useless, fat, dumb girl like you can never win anything. Amelia ran to her tiny room, threw herself onto the thin mattress, and sobbed into her pillow. Back at the fashion school, things were worse. There was one girl, Naomi, who despised Amelia more than anyone else. Naomi was the best student in the entire fashion school, admired by both students and instructors. She came from a wealthy home, had always worn designer clothes, and had a perfect figure. She was the kind of girl Amelia had spent her whole life being invisible to. Naomi took special pleasure in making Amelia's life a living hell. "So, I heard the pig is entering the competition," Naomi sneered one afternoon in the hostel. "I hope the judges have strong stomachs. Imagine having to touch anything sewn by those filthy, sweaty hands." Her friends burst into laughter. Amelia kept her head down, pretending not to hear, but she could feel the heat of humiliation burning in her chest. "Maybe we should all drop out of the competition," another girl teased. "We all know who's going to win." "Of course." Naomi smirked. "Me." The girls cheered. Amelia turned and rushed out before they could see the tears streaming down her face. Amelia spent the next few days avoiding everyone, sinking deeper into her misery. She wanted to quit. There was no point in trying. One evening, after another failed sewing attempt, she sat alone in the showroom, crying silently. "Amelia," a gentle voice called. She looked up to see her instructor, Mrs. Dawson, standing there. "You've been hiding here a lot lately," Mrs. Dawson said, sitting beside her. "Tell me, what's wrong?" Amelia wiped her tears. "I can't do it," she whispered. "I'm a failure. I'll only embarrass myself." Mrs. Dawson sighed. "Do you know why I became a fashion instructor?" Amelia shook her head. "Because I was once just like you. Everyone told me I couldn't do it. I had no money, no confidence, and no one believed in me. But I kept going." She smiled warmly. "You don't have to be perfect, Amelia. You just have to try. Even if you fail, you'll be one step closer than you were before." Something in Mrs. Dawson's words made Amelia's heart ache. Was it really possible that she wasn't doomed to be a failure forever? A few days later, the competition list was released. 150 names. Amelia scrolled down the list with trembling fingers. Her name was the last one. Her stomach twisted. "I shouldn't do this," she whispered. All around her, students were screaming with excitement. Naomi and her friends were celebrating like they had already won. Then, a deep voice spoke beside her. "Why do you look so sad?" Amelia turned, startled. It was him. The senator's son. A new friendship. She had seen him a few times before, always dressed sharply, always carrying himself with quiet confidence. He was handsome, too handsome for someone like her to be talking to. She opened her mouth to answer, but no words came out. He smiled. "I'm Adrian." She stared at him, wide-eyed. Why was he talking to her? "I saw you crying the other day," Adrian continued. "Are you scared of the competition?" She nodded slowly. "You should do it," he said. "I'll be there to cheer you on." Amelia blinked. Why do you care?" Adrian shrugged. "Because I like cheering for the underdog." She didn't know what to say. No one had ever supported her before. From that day on, Adrian made it a habit to check on her. He never treated her like she was invisible or disgusting. He asked about her progress, encouraged her, and told her she was capable. For the first time in her life, Amelia started to believe she might actually have a chance. That evening, she stopped by the old woman's usual spot. She handed her a small package of food. The old woman smiled. You look different today, child. What changed? Amelia hesitated. Someone believes in me. The old woman chuckled. I told you before, Amelia. You will be the best among them. Amelia looked down. I don't think so. You don't see it yet, the woman said softly, but one day, you will. That night, as she lay in her hostel bed, the old woman's words echoed in her mind. You will be the best among them. She dreamed of standing on a stage, holding a trophy, with Adrian clapping in the audience. For the first time in her life, she wanted to fight for something. Training begins. The next day, Amelia did something she had never done before. She stayed after class to practice. She made mistake after mistake. She was laughed at, mocked, humiliated. But she kept going. Every night, while others slept, she stayed up alone, practicing with determination she never knew she had. She stopped eating as much, focused more, and slowly, painfully, improved. By the third week, she sewed her first dress without a single mistake. By the fourth week, her design started catching people's attention. By the fifth week, Naomi stopped laughing. The day of the competition was approaching. For the first time in her life, Amelia wanted to try something different.